First of all, thank you. I think the last 3 days have been really enriching. A lot of deep conversations around food systems, and it's been really a pleasure to meet all of you. One of the few of the things that kind of stood out for me at least was, and I think when we are talking about India, it's a mosaic of landscapes, culture, diversity of food, and the pavilion that we were looking at more closely was specifically focusing on sustainable agriculture. And I think few issues that came out, and this was across different sessions which were looking at, what are the best practices or knowledge that's available in landscapes in context of sustainable agriculture, or context of water. How are we, what's the access to institutional finance or agri finance in general that is available, and how are we really thinking about some of these issues together. And few critical aspects that came out was, well, there is a lot of good practices, lot of learnings that are happening, but a lot of that is happening at districts. There's a lot of sometimes we are not talking enough with each other. And I'll go back to what Jehari said. I think Food System Summit, at least, and I did see a lot of our partners also doing that, this provides an opportunity to come together, discuss, share some of that information. And even in the sessions that I was there, a lot of partners did appreciate that. The other piece, when we talk about sustainable agriculture and most of the best knowledge management practices that were being talked about, there's a lot of intentionality when we think about, even when we're thinking about sustainable agriculture, and how, and it could be called sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. I'm not obviously getting into the nomenclature of that, but most of the partners, when they were talking about, there were few issues that sort of became critical. All of them in their sort of, presentations were focusing on how it's a mix of landscapes and agroecological principles, and how we are thinking about, while it's about food production and nutrition, but also how we are thinking about livelihood diversification and different entry points that become critical. So while, there were good practices that were being discussed for instance, sustainable agriculture, there's already a larger food system perspective that could be seen, where focus was on how do we create that value chain around food. For instance, if you're working around a certain product, if you're developing a WRI model, then how that's, farmers' access to market, for instance, is being connected. And a lot of those examples came up, which sort of, and a larger consensus was that we do need to think about how some of this knowledge is shared better. One big issue when we are thinking about knowledge sharing beyond information, because information is obviously widely available, and Jayari was talking about, he was also looking at, why a wide, quick internet search kind of resulted in what is current level of information, but we really need to think what that information can lead us towards. And few learnings were, when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, the models that work well is how, partners have been using information technology for using, local community workers in terms of what the practice for instances, whether it's through apps, different other ICT mechanisms to look at, creating larger awareness around sustainable agriculture interventions, or just, how do you do landscape level planning, or how do you sort of converge, public funding in a district, for instance, or in few landscapes. And one of the big learning that sort of was emerging as a consensus is, how do we think of philanthropy, for instance, as catalytic, which can unlock, public funding at scale. So there are a lot of these examples that we heard, how some of that could come together. So that was something in context of sustainable agriculture, and, the best practices that came out quite importantly. Similarly, when we think about water, one of the big sort of critical issues that came out, of course, everyone is aware of the challenges around water, but how we are sort of working with, local communities, especially women, in terms of taking forward for more effective water resource management. And that's becomes critical because, because that's how the design of local community-based institutions is critical, especially if you're working in rain-fed areas, but also if it's irrigated areas. How are we thinking about efficiency with the crisis of with climate change and shrinking freshwater resources? Some of these issues are only going to get more difficult. So how we think of a more integrated farming and water ecosystem sort of becomes a critical issue. Of course, soil health is a very critical one and was discussed quite widely in one of the sessions where how are we thinking about importance of soil? And, while there are soil health cards, and that's important, but we do need to, again, it becomes an issue of collaboration between different sort of departments, where different departments come together when we're thinking about watershed development, but we are thinking about soil health in a more concentrated way. Similarly, like when you're doing landscape approaches, you need to think about, how a lot of these things come together. Lastly, and I think that's the most important one, which is also the biggest barrier. How are we thinking about, there is a lot more finance, agri-finance and investments that are needed if we are thinking about a pathway for sustainable agriculture, but that's the most difficult one to access. And a lot of sort of, discussions that were dealt, and we don't have all the answers. And I think that's something which needs to be picked up, discussed a lot more in terms of agriculture in general, considered a very risky lending sector. And how do we, access to finance for farmers or even startups, farmer producer companies, etc. They have better access to finance. What is the sort of blending of, that can be created? And one should be looking at banks, for instance, or, public banks. Are they going to be showing the way, or do we need to look at other sort of, institutions who might be able to do that better? Because eventually, if we are talking about, a transition and thinking about circular food systems, it is going to come to financing. And I think that's where the biggest issue is, which is also a lot of issue of financing is also linked to monitoring. Because if any investments are done, what is the outcome that needs to be measured? What sort of incentive mechanisms, what is going to be monitored? And a lot of that needs to be dealt. So it's just scratching of the surface, I would say, that was discussed in some of those sessions. But we're really hoping to take forward some of those conversations as we move forward later on that. And yeah, happy to answer questions later, if any. Thank you.